Eddie, let me tell you, if I read the whole bio, I'm afraid you don't have any time. Just say he is, that that's what I will remove. Oh, thank you. I wanted to come to some standard, but you so damn sweet and clean, and then you couldn't make anything up. Well, that's good. The swords are awesome. You know, that's right. They're in the closet somewhere with their stuff. No, couple of minutes, six. I want to get. It's kind of. It's always. Yeah. Yeah, I said, I'm ready. If I could ask everyone to please take their seats, we're going to resume our programming. So I'd like to welcome everybody back. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who will be delivering the Feliciano Rozycki Historical Lecture. The Feliciano Rozycki Historical Lecture is named after Southeastern Surgical Congress past presidents and spouses dedicated to the growth and future of the Southeastern and its mission. David Feliciano served as Southeastern Surgical Congress president from 2016 to 2017, and Grace Rozycki served as the SASC president from 2011 to 2012. And since then, both have been awarded the Distinguished Service Award from the Congress. The historical lecture that they've endowed is given each year by the president-elect. And it's my pleasure to introduce this year's president-elect, Dr. Eddie Cornwell from Howard University. Dr. Cornwell was born and raised in D.C. He attended Sidwell Friends School and then received his undergraduate education at Brown in Providence, Rhode Island, graduating with his biology degree in '78. He then attended Howard and graduated with honors and AOA distinction and served as class president in 1982. Dr. Cornwell received a surgical training, both internship and residency, at the LA County University of Southern California Medical Center and his trauma critical care fellowship at the Maryland Institute for Medical Services Systems in Baltimore. He has been certified and recertified in both general surgery and surgical critical care by the ABS and has risen through the academic ranks through teaching and clinical appointments at Howard, USC, and Johns Hopkins. He is a former professor and chairman of the Department of Surgery at Howard University and a former interim dean at Howard University College of Medicine. His career interest is in the prevention, treatment, and outcome disparities of traumatic injuries and their critical care sequelae. He has authored or co-authored over 260 articles and chapters and has given over 340 invited presentations in the field. Among his activities in numerous surgical and critical care societies, Dr. Cornwell is the former chief editor of the Multidisciplinary Critical Care Knowledge Assessment Program sponsored by the Society of Critical Care Medicine. He has served as president of the Society of Black Academics Surgeons, president of the surgical section of the National Medical Association, and chairman of the Trauma Net of Maryland. He has served as head of numerous committees, panels, or as moderator for scientific sessions at the AAST, the American Board of Surgery, Society of Critical Care Medicine, the ASA, and the ACS. He has past secretary of the ACS and was on the board of managers of the AAST. And he is currently the president-elect of the Southeastern Surgical Congress. With that, I'll welcome Dr. Cornwell to the podium for his presentation entitled Dr. Asa Yancey Sr., A Quiet Giant in American Surgery.
Thank you, Mr. President. For reasons that will quickly become obvious, my mother, my 95-year-old mother, asked if she should join us and come for this lecture. I said, no, Ma, it's going to be tough travel. Let's try and aim for next year. But if I had known that Dr. Richmond was going to read that introduction the way she wrote it, I would have insisted that she come back. So I appreciate that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, please indulge me as I take an atypical amount of time, having no disclosures, to talk about my family as a vehicle in describing Asa Yancey, A Quiet Giant in American Surgery, a title that I borrowed from a paper I co-authored with my friend and colleague John Stewart. But I'm going to talk about my family as a way to convince you that this is not some perfunctory lip service to the honor of giving this talk. This is a heartfelt honor for me and my family, as will become obvious in a second. This is a 39-year-old photo. My mother and father standing in the back, myself on your far left, my brother David on your right standing, and right in front of me seated is my brother Michael. He's the youngest of the 6 Cornwell children. This is the occasion of my father getting an alumni award from Howard University College of Medicine, where he preceded me. And people have seen that, oh, what a great family photo. And it is superficially, but to most of us, it's a little bittersweet because my father doesn't have quite the gleam that we used to associate with him. That photo was taken about 7 months before he died of pancreatic cancer. He was a surgeon who had a clinical appointment at Howard, but he operated, as many did in the time, at many different hospitals. One of my favorite summers is the summer after my junior year in undergrad, driving him around and going to the operating room with him and letting him talk about his first love of surgery. It was a great education for me. But he would die 7 months after that photo was taken. And at that time, I was an intern. My older sisters were already in business and law. My brother David was in law school. My sister Brenda was at Wharton. But Michael was only 15 years old. And so a close family became closer. And of course, we all focused our attention on Michael there in the middle with me and my brother David, and his having the same guidance that the older 5 siblings did. Now, of course, as the youngest, he was the kid that came through without any problem. We had nothing to worry about. But when he went to Yale undergrad, came home, go to Howard. My father lectured to me as a third-year student on pancreas, cancer of the pancreas. He probably had cancer of the pancreas at the time he gave that lecture. When I joined the faculty at Howard out of training, my brother Michael, 11 years my junior, was a medical student, and I lectured to him in some trauma topics. And I tried to give him guidance about the life of surgery. You know, sleep when you can, eat when you can, make no changes after 4 o'clock. Don't mess with the pancreas, of course, we would say that. But when it was time for him and he chose to go into surgery to pursue surgical training, like myself, we all loved Atlanta. My sister Terry went to Spelman. And right at the top of his list was Emory. operating as they do at Grady Hospital. This is a talk that has a lot of Grady Hospital connections to it. And by this time, I already was a junior faculty member. I knew about the fantastic trauma book that Dave Feliciano had written. I knew about that institution at Grady and the great contributions that Doctors Feliciano and Rozycki had made in trauma and their predecessors at that, Harlan Stone and Tim Fabian, when the evolution of management of colon injuries probably started with a paper there. That institution that talked about selective management of abdominal, penetrating abdominal injuries, the complication of a non-therapeutic laparotomy, the management of Dr. Feliciano as he was a surgeon doing your own head, neck trauma, thoracic trauma, abdominal vascular trauma. And I think the single best clinical paper I've read was a paper he wrote about the ways you can go wrong in placing a retrocable shunt for injuries to the juxtahepatic cava, retrohepatic cava or juxtacava hepatic veins. I've made a couple of those mistakes, Dr. Feliciano. So when I once had a survivor, can you imagine a patient in hemorrhagic shock? You're going to do a Pringle clamp. You're going to do a sternotomy, a purse string suture in the atrium and put a chest tube or an endotracheal tube such that the holes are all above and below where your clamps are, and you can't deprive the lower extremity venous return. And a patient's already in hemorrhagic shock, and the ways you could stick that tube right out of the hole. You've heard the saying, it's easy to say, not easy to do. That's not even easy to say. And so it's for all those reasons I said Mike Emery should be at the top of your list. He was fortunate enough to train there, and so he got great training from Dave Feliciano. Now, not long after he left, after my father died, the Washington Hospital Center created an Edward Cornwell Teaching Award. My father was junior, I'm third, and a young faculty member at Washington Hospital Center got that award by the name of Grace Rozycki. She now comes down to Grady, where Mike is a surgical resident. He's working with her on one of her great contributions, the evolution, the role of focused abdominal sonography for trauma. Michael was working on some projects with that and walked into her office, and what's on her wall? The Edward Cornwell Teaching Award. This is the circle of life that Grace Rozycki teaching Edward Cornwell's son. And so when I was offered was invited to give this lecture on the name of these great contributors to our art and science of surgery, the entire Cornwell family was thrilled because Grace Rozycki and David Feliciano are near and dear to our hearts. Why Asa Yancey? Well, I come back, as you heard, in my training after I went back out to USC as a faculty member, I come back east to shock trauma. I come back east to Hopkins as a chief of trauma for 10 years. Dr. John Cameron recruited me, and he used to have, and I took from him what he did, always have faculty chats every 6 months or so. And he said, and you know, when you have a great man like that, who's this dominant personality, you tend to assume his characteristics. And Dr. Cameron asked me one day, now, Eddie, are you in all the appropriate societies? And I said, the only thing left, Dr. Cameron, is the Southern and the American Surgical. And he was pleased that I said that. He said, yeah, they'll love you. They'll love Maggie. They love LaSalle and Ruthie. They haven't always had a great history, Eddie. And we knew about this story. Dr. Organ had told me about this story, that when Dr. LaFall went up for the Southern, my second most influential man in my life, LaSalle LaFall, he had been a chair for 15 years. He had been an officer of the college, president of the Society of Surgical Chairs and the American Cancer Society, and apparently didn't go through on his first vote. Walter Lawrence, the late Walter Lawrence, just died a few years ago, an honorary member of Society of Black Academic Surgeons, at that meeting publicly protested Dr. LaFall not getting through. They quickly scrambled, voted him in. And I said, I know that story, Dr. Cameron, but you know, maybe Dr. Organ is being a little mischievous, but he said they didn't know they already had a Black member. He said, who? I said, Asa Yancey. He said, who? I said, Asa Yancey. I'm saying it wasn't quite like that. I said, Asa Yancey, sir, but he walked across the room to get his roster, and there it was, Asa Yancey. And Dr. Cameron who's a great surgical historian, was surprised to know that. Did not know Asa Yancey had been in it. Wait till you hear about all the things Asa Yancey has done. So I gave a history lecture on Charles Drew, Asa Yancey's mentor, and I would argue Asa Yancey is Dr. Drew's most accomplished trainee. And at the end of that talk, Dave Feliciano walked to me and said, I've known this man for many years. I didn't know he had done all those things. And I believe it because he's a man of great humility. He wrote a book that most of us call, and there's his mentor, Dr. Drew. I consider Dr. Drew, Yancey, and two other members I'll mention, surgical forefathers, as kind of my heroes. And Dr. Drew's mantra through people like Yancey was excellence of performance will transcend artificial barriers created by man. Dr. Yancey's 96-year lifespan is a story of that link between the days after surgery throughout the Jim Crow South and the diversity that you see growing throughout surgery has its roots related to Dr. Drew and Dr. Yancey. This book is autobiographical, but Dr. Yancey would not call it an autobiography. His language was, education was received at. He is a man, despite his accomplishments, of great humility. So I'm not the least bit surprised that a lot of people don't recognize all that Asa Yancey has accomplished. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, his father actually got education at Tuskegee in carpentry. Many of the land grant schools coming out of slavery in the South would focus on technology. Carpentry was certainly being that, and that's why you see schools, Florida A&M, agricultural and mechanics, Alabama A&M, North Carolina A&T. So Dr. Yancey's father was an educated man, did a lot of carpentry around the house, had a fairly good job for the time, for a Black in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s in Georgia, as in the post office. But he would not ride the segregated streetcar, so he rode a bike to work every day. He was an author as well as a worker, and his values were passed on to his 9 children, 3 of whom, 2 died shortly after birth and 1 a year after. But Asa, 3 of his sons would go into medicine. Asa was the valedictorian at Morehouse in 1937. And like his brother, this is extremely unusual, like his brother, would go to the University of Michigan in 1937, graduate in 1941. There's a story behind that. Now, by the time the Flexner Report is written in 1910, it had the impact of standardizing medical curriculum and what resources you should have. And it led to the closing of nearly half of the medical schools, so-called medical schools in North America, and only 2 of the 7 schools in the South that were open to educate former slaves and their descendants survived the Flexner Report. There would be Howard in Washington, D.C., and Meharry. And so they were extremely competitive, unyielding in their admission criteria. But you'll have about 5 or 10% from the 1920s all the way up into the 1970s of physicians of color going to schools other than Howard or Meharry. Asa Yancey and his brother Bernice Yancey, 11 years older than him, were 2 such examples of that. Bernice Yancey, by all accounts, was brilliant, a wonderful musician, like his father, very good with his hands, helped to build a primitive automobile in the family. And he goes to the University of Michigan in 1926 and graduates in 1930. Now, a lot of people don't recognize that as schools, and there were, as I said, occasional schools in the upper Midwest and Northeast that would have occasional Black students in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. But many people don't recognize that the last barrier in diversity in specialties, particularly surgical specialties, is going to be residency training. They would have to craft together years of training from one place or another, because even if you integrated a class in the medical school, in those decades, you were not going to train at that hospital. You weren't going to give orders to white nurses or take care of white women. And so Bernice Yancey was a perfect example of that. He graduates 1930, and then he goes to St. Louis, one of about 8 hospitals throughout the states where a Black could get postgraduate training. Hospital number 2 in St. Louis, handling some faulty X-ray equipment, got electrocuted and killed. And the Telegraph, Asa was playing on a tennis court that his father built for the family just west of his house, and he could hear his mother's bone-curdling screams. He was only 14 years old himself. B.A. Yancey, Bernice Arthur Yancey, is dead, give instructions on how to dispose of the body was the compassionate telegraph that his mother received. And so the family focused on young Asa, and he did not let them down. He would go to the University of Michigan, graduate, performed very well, graduated, and this was a historic class. There were 4 Negro students, the term of the time, 4 Black students in that class of 1941, graduating from the University of Michigan. You Virginians may recognize the name Maggie Walker. She's named for her grandmother, the first Black female millionaire and a Black entrepreneur. And the 3 men, Asa Yancey, Martin Sutler, C. Waldo Scott, would all graduate. They would all go into surgery, and they would all come to the one place where people would want to come, train under Charles Richard Drew. So they all did some of their training at Freedman's Hospital where Blacks of DC, of my vintage, where I and 2 of my siblings were born. But they would come and get some of their training under Dr. Charles Richard Drew, the new chair of surgery at Howard. Now, Dr. Sutler would go back to his native Ohio, where he built a successful surgical career in Cleveland. And some of you Virginians may recognize C. Waldo Scott, and sitting next to Maggie Walker. He's a spitting image of his son, Bobby Scott, the first Black congressman after Reconstruction in Virginia. I think former President Britt, I think he may be your congressman, Bobby Scott, but he looks just like his father, C. Waldo Scott. And so after graduating, Asa Yancey goes to the City Hospital for a year at Cleveland and then gains residency training at Freedman's Hospital under Charles Richard Drew, a man who he shares a reverence for that those of us who are devotees of Dr. LaFalle recognize. Dr. Drew was dedicated. He's like Dr. Yancey is on my Mount Rushmore. This is a big sports day in America, and we always talk who's the GOAT and who's on the Rushmore. Dr. Drew and Yancey are 2 of the 4 members on my Mount Rushmore, and he would get outstanding training from Dr. Drew. And during that World War II time, both medical schools and residency trainings was accelerated. So there were 2 classes, med school graduating classes in Howard, and 2 residency training classes at Howard and Freedman's Hospital in 1944, March and December, and Dr. Yancey finished that training December 44. And Charles Drew was the sort of mentor whose dedication to his trainees went far beyond their years of training. He would arrange for most of them to go throughout various places, many times throughout the South, where they would forge a more complete society through their excellence in performance, which is going to transcend these artificial barriers created by man. And so Dr. Yancey in the military would get another year of fellowship training at the U.S. Marine Hospital and go to Meharry College, where he would get more experience with pelvic surgery. That would be important because their well-developed OBGYN department at Freedman's Hospital in Howard kept the surgical residents for doing as much pelvic surgery as they wanted. While he was at Meharry, he would become familiar with the Taborian Hospital in Mount Bayou, Mississippi. Matthew Walker was the chair of the department at that time, and he would spend the years as a surgeon, director of the surgical program there, and ultimately with Drew's help, in July of 1948, Asa Yancey, at the age of 32, would become the director of the surgical training program at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. This is a VA hospital for Black vets. Imagine in Alabama in 1948, the Klan was not happy when that hospital opened in 1922. And the question was, who was going to be the leadership? Well, it's just for Black patients. Ultimately, President Harding had to get involved. Calvin Coolidge, the vice president, came down to mark the opening of that hospital. But it would ultimately have Black leadership as you had this critical mass of people who are qualified to train surgeons of color. So Asa Yancey is the leader of a surgical training program in the Deep South from 1948 to 1958. Credited program with the partnership of people like Ira Ferguson. Don Nakayama wrote about that partnership. Gave me too much credit, by the way. Don, thank you very much. I'll get over it. But Ira Ferguson, coming from Emory, would be some of the people that would contribute to the training in this program. There's 3 phenomenal things that happened during his Tuskegee years. One is they had a very well-developed veterinary program, and he got to operate on dogs and pursue his interest in this disease that he became accustomed, that he saw patients in his year in Mississippi. He was developing a reputation as an outstanding clinical and operative surgeon. He started to see these young children who had this congenital megacolon from loss of absence of neuronal plexus in the distal rectal sigmoid. And so he would start to work on an operation other than these kids who would have either lifelong colostomies or fecal incontinence, who typically by fashioning perineal anastomosis from the more proximal innervated colon down into the perineum. Another fascinating thing, the thing that fascinates me about this program is the John Andrew Hospital, named for a benefactor, a hospital affiliated with Tuskegee, would be a place where there'd be great clinical programs and one of the most sought after scientific assemblies every year. This is in the Deep South in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, where Black and white surgeons would come, they would operate on patients, they would do demonstrations, and they would give talks. Alan Oldfather Whipple, Ira Ferguson himself, Charles Drew, here's a photo of Dr. Yancey with Dr. Whipple, in the segregated South are participating together for the benefit of training at these programs. That fascinates me to this day. This is where Dr. Drew himself was coming to participate on the last night of his life. And so James Hardy, you see the name, who would go on as chair of surgery at Mississippi to do the first lung transplant. These are the people that are coming to the Andrew Clinic as Asa Yancey trained 51 surgeons of color over a 10-year period at this program that had accreditation thanks to a collaborative partnership. His great scientific contribution was in the management of Hirschsprung's disease. Originally, as I said, we treated with just a perineal anastomosis. That thickened, more proximal innervated colon is well innervated, but it's that distal aganglionic segment that would form a pseudo obstruction. First in dogs, and then in a young girl, Dr. Yancey performed a modification where he would leave a seromuscular sleeve of the rectosigmoid, tease out the mucosa and submucosa that was aganglionic of that same segment, and then pass the more proximal colon through that seromuscular sleeve and fashion a perineal anastomosis. The child survived the operation, but sadly died of a garden variety small bowel obstruction and volvulus. She had an autopsy showing that perineal anastomosis was intact, and Dr. Yancey published this in the Journal of the National Medical Association, 1952, a journal that would not be in the libraries of most majority institutions at that time, some 70 years ago. But that was 12 years before it, and most pediatric surgeons and colorectal surgeons will recognize that as what we now call the Soave procedure, published as it was 12 years later by Dr. Soave. A new, I don't believe you heard me, a new surgical technique 12 years after Asa Yancey published this paper, Modification of the Swinson Technique. Well, Dr. Drew, dedicated as he was to his residents, I don't have a pointer, but I'll just say, you see Dr. Drew on the far right, and if you go 3 people over the middle, there are 2 residents. Faculty members traveling into the South had to make plans. Their plan was to go from DC to Atlanta, freshen up at a YMCA, and then from Atlanta to Birmingham. That was their plan. A long day before that ensued, and they left DC about 1 a.m. the morning of April 1st, 1950. Dr. John Ford was in the back seat after Dr. Drew took the wheel about 5:30 in the morning in Alamance County Hospital. Dr. Drew quickly fell asleep after he took the wheel. His faculty colleagues, Sam Bullock, said, "Charlie, watch out." Dr. Drew woke up, and his corrective motion of the car had the car swerve and ultimately tumble over, landing upright after 2 revolutions. Much of the weight of the car came down on Dr. Drew's head and neck, killing him. The 2 residents were thrown from the car. Dr. John Ford who appears this way. When I interviewed him in 2004, September, about that night, 54 years later, he remembered it like it was the day before. They did everything they could for Dr. Drew, and they took him to that small segregated hospital. They received Black and white patients together in one emergency area, but if they were admitted, they'd go to separate wards. Dr. Ford had a humerus fracture. When we talked about that night in my interview of Dr. Yancey in September of 2004, he broke down and cried 54 years after his mentor and hero was killed. So important was Dr. Drew in his training. Dr. Drew would not live to see Dr. Yancey complete his 10-year stint as the head of surgery at Tuskegee, or to return to his native Atlanta, to Grady Hospital. Now in 58, Grady Hospital was still segregated. They had the Hughes Pavilion adjacent to it. And so Asa Yancey again got accreditation for surgical residency at that institution, 2 institutions in the Deep South from 1948 until the integration of Grady in 1965, training surgeons of color in 2 institutions. Somebody knew about his articles. He gets admitted to inducted into the Institute of Medicine, membership in the American Surgical, actually got in the American Surgical 2 years before the Southern Surgical, and ultimately became associate dean, climbing the academic ranks to associate dean and medical director of Grady from 1972 to 1989. And it wasn't just about clinical and academics. He and his wife and his children, who grew up much of their time in Alabama, were active. And he was head of the Board of Education and part of the Atlanta plan for relatively speaking, compared to Mississippi and Alabama, relatively uneventful integration of the schools in Atlanta. There's an Asa Yancey clinic down there affiliated with Grady. There's an Asa Yancey lecture in the Society of Black Academic Surgeons, an Asa Yancey lecture. I was honored to give it first at University of Michigan, and honorary degrees at Morehouse and Howard. And it's having done all of that, someone such as Dave Feliciano would say, I didn't know he did all those things, because he was a quintessential Southern gentleman without any self-promotion, who was dedicated to his trainees. And so many, when you start to tell the story of how improving diversity throughout this country, particularly in surgery, it starts with Asa Yancey, who had potentially great personal sacrifice in Alabama, and some danger perhaps, started a residency training program at 2 institutions. This photo grows ever more dear to me with each passing year. This is 1989, the inaugural photo of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons. A whole nother talk about it. 30 people in that photo, 29 men, they're all surgeons. The woman at the upper middle was a lab tech and the sister of the cousin of Dr. Anya Aquari, who's sitting with the striped red and black tie. To your left, Dr. David Saperstein's white. Dr. Saperstein, the host, this meeting was at Duke, in the white coat down on the front row. On the far upper left, that's Dr. Asa Yancey. The 3 of my 4 Mount Rushmore people all died before I was born. Asa Yancey is the only one that I had the pleasure of meeting myself. And the Asa Yancey, and he was a loyal member and one of the founding members of SBAS. I'm 2 people to his right. And over on the top row, sitting one from the far end on the right, Dr. Steve Stain. He and I were at USC together. We were in training when this photo was taken. And there's no women in this photo. Now, John Norman, another great West Virginian, Dr. Richmond, John Norman was at this meeting. The only time I laid eyes on him, a prolific author and great author and cardiovascular surgeon. Dr. LaFall was at this meeting. My chair, Dr. Arthur Donovan, was at this meeting. They were not there for the photo on that day, but Dr. Yancey was, and Dr. Yancey would have lived to see with great pride a photo 28 years later when the meeting at Ohio State was held. Almost 150 surgeons in that photo, 46% women. No women in the first one, 1989. Takes about 32 years or so. 28 years later, this photo, and in this photo would be the first African-American female chair in surgery, who succeeded Steve Stain, who was with me on the upper row of that, K. Marie King, and the second African-American female chair, my own chair and dean, Dr. Andrea Hayes Dixon. They're in that photo, and Dr. Yancey would live to see, through Dr. Drew's inspiration, he fortunately would live to see the changing face of surgery. How does this story end about that new surgical disease? For 13 years as chair, I would tell this story to new incoming interns and talk about the legacy and the excellence of performance transcending artificial barriers created by man. And one year, an intern raised her hand and said, Dr. Cornwell, isn't there some society that can correct these things? I said, yeah. And this is the meeting. If we don't tell that story, who's going to tell it? And sure enough, Dr. Erica Newman, a pediatric surgeon at Michigan, took that mantle, and through the American Pediatric Surgical Association, their work, we got the news just a few months ago that the Swenson technique is being recoded and renamed. The Yancey, the former Swenson technique, is going to heretofore be known as the Yancey Suave procedure. And so my Mount Rushmore includes people of my heroes generation who all trained somewhere, went to medical school somewhere other than Howard or Meharry, who all had to come back and spend part of their career at one of the very few institutions, Freedman's Hospital, where I was born, to do some of their training and some of their teaching. Dr. Charles Drew on your far left, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, the founding member, the only Black among the founding members of the American College of Surgeons, ultimately a president of the National Medical Association. Dr. Yancey, as we just talked about, and on the far right, Dr. Louis Wright, who was the second Black member of the American College of Surgeons, 21 years after Daniel Hale Williams was the first and only. All of them would have sentinel contributions, scientific contributions, and blood transfusion, and in blood storage and transfusion. In Dr. Williams' case, in autoclaving and sterility, founded his own hospital and started the nursing school at Howard. Dr. Yancey, as we mentioned, and Louis Wright in vaccination and early antibiotics, all on the Mount Rushmore. And Asa Yancey is the only one that I had the pleasure to know. And I've had a great pleasure to bring Asa Yancey before you. Who? Asa Yancey. That's who. Thank you for your attention. It's been a great honor. Dr. Manning.
Fantastic. I've been a huge fan of Dr. Drew. I did a piece on him for the bulletin.
So thank you, Dr. Cornwell. On behalf of Dr. David Feliciano, Dr. Grace Rozycki, and the Southeastern, it's my pleasure to present our President-elect, Dr. Eddie Cornwell, with this award commemorating his delivery of this outstanding address. Thank you.